Here today with Tim Buckley. Tim is considered to be right at the vanguard of analysis of renewable energy and of course coal and gas and that traditional energy stuff as well. He's been 12 years now, mostly at IEFA as a renewable energy expert, particularly on coal. He's got most of his calls right, except for of course the spiralling, absolutely astronomical spike in coal and gas prices right at the moment. Tim, tell us about what made you move quickly to background from being in the finance world to suddenly going into renewable and taking a massive pay cut in order to advance the cause of energy transition. Was it just the science?
It was actually probably more the magnitude of the investment opportunity, and the science comes later in my understanding. The way I was evolving my thinking, I was investing in China. I was investing in global energy technology companies, looking at the investment opportunity. Where there's risk, there's an opportunity. So we were investing globally, and the more I looked at the global leaders, the more I realized China was actually the leader. And the more I realized that the West really hadn't cottoned on to how strongly invested China was actually in all of the different solutions and how aggressively they were targeting the investment, the employment and the export opportunities. So it really came back from the understanding that the energy disruption was happening a lot faster than people thought, because it was happening in China first and the West was actually a little asleep at the wheel. And so it was probably that was the awakening, that when China decides to do something, they do it at a speed and a scale that the West can't really fathom. And so that gave me the confidence to realize that the energy disruption was real, it was happening, and that we were going to underestimate the speed of it.
And of course, we've had a decade of climate wars, of denialism, Australia being a laggard on the world stage in terms of emissions. We're hopeful, of course, that Labor will now do something about it, although they are funded, of course, donors by the gas sector and so on. But look, just to get to the thing that's going to hit a lot of Australians, energy poverty is now a reality. And this winter, there's going to be a lot of elderly Australians, Australian families indeed, shivering under their blankets because they can't afford to turn on the heater. Can we just go quickly to bills and the price of, obviously, the rising price of gas and coal are central to this. Can you just give us your view on what's going to happen in terms of, just for the normal person paying their energy bills, what's going to happen to these prices?
For decades, Australia was largely insulated in the domestic market. We did not have, particularly on the east coast of Australia, an export market for gas. We had 100% isolated domestic gas market. And that all changed in 2015 when Gladstone opened up not one LNG, liquid natural gas export train, they opened up 6 concurrently. And so that put Australia onto a position where we were now the #1 exporter of liquid natural gas in the world virtually overnight. Now, that changed the dynamics. We had 50 years of literally flat domestic gas prices. There was no export market. All of the product was sold domestically. It was an annuity. It would $3 or $4 a MMBTU year in, year out, add a little bit of inflation, and that was it. Half the price of gas globally and locked in with no alternate competition. So I'd isolate that. And Bruce Robinson from IEFA has constantly talked about the gouging of the gas cartel. And that...
Well, Bruce, of course, famously came up with the idea that the Japanese customers in Japan are paying less for Australian gas once it's exported 23,000 k's over to Japan, even piped from say the Bass Strait up to Gladstone, turned into liquids, and then all that process, that cost, that distance, and it's still cheaper to buy gas in Japan. I mean, it's a huge irony that we've created this export industry, but it's what it's meant because of export price parity is that prices have gone through the roof. So what's going to happen to them now?
They are literally going through the roof as we speak. So Australia maybe 6 months behind the European gas crisis. So Putin's played a massive game here when we come back to Europe. But what we're now seeing is Australian domestic energy markets responding to the global trend like never before. And we've seen record high global coal and gas prices, and Australian consumers are actually going to wear that because the coal price, we are a global export leader in thermal and coking coal. Coal prices have gone up 5-10-fold in the last 2 years. But normally it's gas that sets the marginal cost of electricity generation. And because we've had record low gas prices, that's been great for consumers. And the more renewables you put in, the more gas firming we've needed until this current wave of batteries has taken over. But gas sets the marginal price of electricity.
And that's up 400% spot prices, isn't it? So.
It's, I mean, in Australia this week, we saw the gas price go up to $100. It used to be 3 to 4. It was 10 a month ago.
That's on the spot market.
Spot market, but we're talking about a quadrupling of the gas price domestically. And so the Australian consumer, whether that's the residential market or the industrial market, is absolutely getting it in the neck now. And we've never, prior to 2015, we never had that experience. Western Australia has always been an export market, but they brought in a domestic gas reservation. The gas is an Australian public asset. If we're going to let private, even foreign companies use it, let's make sure we've quarantined enough for domestic purposes. In other words, this is not a free market. At the end of the day, Chevron, Exxon.
Well, it's a cartel of 4 players, effectively,
correct.
Isn't it?
And so we need the government to actually regulate in the interest of the 25 million Australians. They've done it in Western Australia really effectively. And so for 5 or 10 years, we've been saying Australia on the East Coast needs a domestic market reservation, a gas reservation. Now, obviously, the previous government totally ignored that. They love free markets, or they love subsidies for their mates. Somehow that's a free market. But at the end of the day, they've left the entire population on the East Coast of Australia and our entire domestic industry at the mercy of the gas cartel. And we are now seeing gas prices going up 5-fold, 10-fold, 20-fold, just as they're doing in Japan and just as they're doing in Europe. So that is crippling the average Australian.
So the cost of the coal and gas is a large part of, obviously, generation, a large part of the energy bill. Excuse me, what are energy bills going to do then? They're going to double? Are people going to pay double what they're paying now?
We have to expect gas prices are going to double at least. The regulated price of electricity in Australia in the East Coast is heavily regulated, and we actually just got, funny enough, a couple of days after the federal election. It was meant to come out just before the election.
So they knew it. So the government, the coalition knew that prices were going to go up 30%. And they deliberately they electioneered and campaigned on lower energy prices. The coalition is good for lower energy prices. Angus Taylor, Josh Frydenberg, that was their position. And of course, they delayed the announcement until after the election. Is that correct?
3 days after the election, the announcement was legislated to happen on the 1st of May. Angus Taylor, of course, this only comes out after the election. Angus Taylor deliberately delayed it to the 26th of May, 3 days after the election, 3 work days after, and lo and behold, prices going through the roof. So everything that Josh Frydenberg said in his budget, everything the LNP said in the federal election was a knowingly false statement, because they talked about what had happened historically, knowing full well that within a month, the price would be going through the roof. And it was evident in the market. And in the meantime, the wholesale power price has actually gone up 500%. In the last couple of weeks, we've seen the wholesale price of electricity at $300 a megawatt hour. It averages $50 to $60 normally.
So that means bills are going to double.
Correct. So
you've got distribution and retail costs and all that as well. And we'll get, by the way, onto AGL. Tim's involved in the deal of the moment in Australia, the AGL deal, and so on. And we'll get onto the politics in a moment. But just what is your estimate then for power bills? How much will we going to be paying?
Well, just this week we saw Frank Calabria, the CEO of Origin Energy, come out and put out a profit downgrade. The stock this week on one day was down 17% immediately on the back of a massive profit warning. He can't secure coal So much for coal power being reliable. Eraring has literally not been able to operate because they can't get coal. And if he buys it in the spot market, he now has to compete with export price parity. So the price is up 500% on what he's used to paying. You know, you can't afford to turn Eraring on. It's that ludicrous that in the middle of the highest wholesale prices for electricity ever in Australian history, and the biggest coal-fired power plant is unable to operate at full capacity. And in fact, 30% of the coal fleet in Australia last month was offline. So much for Angus Taylor. Coal might be polluting, but it's reliable. No, the reliability of the Australian coal fleet has never been lower. And that's obvious because it's aging, it's near its end of life. So at the end of the day, we've got a situation where the regulator has allowed an increase in electricity prices for all the east coast of Australia. It's in the order of 8, 10, 20, 30%. Origin Energy has come out and said, no, our costs have just gone up 500%. We actually cannot cover the increase that the regulators allowed in the retail price because the wholesale price has not doubled, but it's quadrupled. And so we're going to see another round of price rises. Just this week, we've seen a couple of major independent electricity retailers.
So they can't provide, we don't want you as a customer.
Correct.
Because we can't
will
afford
lose money with every unit they sell.
So what does it mean then? I mean, the bills are going to more than double, aren't they?
That in the short to medium term is an inevitability. And as you say, that's going to hit the poorest people in Australia hardest. Yeah. So yes, we've got an absolute energy crisis that is, it's unprecedented. I mean, when I started in the energy space 15 years ago, I talked to one of chairman of my company, and he was the chair of one of the biggest super funds in Australia. And I asked him why he was involved in a tiny startup like ours. Yeah. And I said, is it climate change? And this was 15 years ago. And he goes, not really. I don't really understand climate change. But what I do know is energy security drives every nation in the world. And at the time I said to him, oh, maybe Australia is the only exception to that because we are one of the largest exporters of energy in the world. We're blessed as a nation with the best wind, the best solar, the best hydro. We've even got uranium, we've got coal, we've got everything. No matter what the technology you want to do, we could do any of it. Fast forward 15 years, 10 years of the LNP in government, we now have a domestic energy crisis that's as bad as Europe.
Well, are the climate wars over? I mean, you've still got Matt Canavan, he's still in office, batting away for coal, but are they over now? I mean, the arguments called climate change, most of corporate Australia has now embraced the science and is reacting to the energy transition. They've been ahead of the government, as you say, but are the climate wars actually over? Are we going to get firm action from Labor, do you think?
Yeah, the jury's still out. I am hugely relieved at the federal election. Yeah. And I am banking on the fact that the Greens have a very aggressive climate policy. They always have been a world leader in acknowledging the science and wanting to act on it. They have a very significant stake, particularly in the Senate. So Labor's going to have to work with the Greens. We've also now got the rise of the Teals, and that is a brilliant moderate force of people. All of them were elected with climate change, acting aggressively to solve the climate crisis as a core part of their mandate. And so you all of a sudden have these very clear groups that are groups of independents that are very much aligned with acting with the science. So what I would say is the ALP's stated strategy, 43% emissions reduction by 2030.
It's too slow.
It's way too slow, particularly when you know that Morrison and his gang chose 2005 as the benchmark. Well, normally when you hear the UK strategy of 68% emissions reduction or President Biden's strategy of a 52% emissions reduction by 2030, it's against a target, a base year of 1990 or 2000.
So they chose the peak.
They chose emissions the absolute peak of 2005. So if you pick 2000, you find our emissions actually went up 10 or 15%. So at the end of the day, the 26 to 28 was the ABC fact check. RMIT said it was just outright lie. But 43% in that context, that the base year of 2005 is a false number. It's a false starting point. It's not aligned with any other country in the world. But 43% is not aligned with the Paris Agreement. It's not. So what I would say, though, in defence of the ALP, I think it's really important that the Albanese government actually be quite centralist and actually bring the whole country along. So it's great that we've got voices for much more ambition, but the reality is some of the policies that the Albanese government, Chris Bowen, has put forward are remarkably ambitious. And so let's talk a different number. Let's talk 82% renewables by 2030. Now, that in its own right would be a world-leading outcome, and it would be a phenomenal outcome. That is a core part of the Albanese-Bowen plan. So if we delivered 82% renewable energy by 2030, that will require 50 or 100 billion, probably $100 billion of new investment in the next 5, 10, 15 years to accelerate the modernisation of the grid, the repurposing of the grid, to allow it to accommodate massive deployment of renewable energy, utility-scale wind, utility-scale solar, a doubling of the rooftop solar, if not more, a rollout of electric vehicles, which are better described as batteries on wheels, because they will provide a huge new source of grid firming capacity. And in all of that sort of context, we're talking about a massive acceleration of ambition. But a key point you actually made it, the reality is that is absolutely central to almost every major corporate's stated strategy. Boards of Australia have already signed off on an alignment with Paris, net zero by 2050, aggressive interim targets. The Global Finance Alliance for Net Zero has $130 trillion of capital. It's already signed off on accelerated aggressive ambition this decade. So the reality is Albo's government now has moved in alignment with all of our state governments, but just as importantly, in alignment with all of the major corporates and all of the financial institutions. So it's really, to me, the wars are over, the climate wars are over, because everyone's now on the same page, and all we're going to be debating is how fast do we do it.
How fast? So you've got the third force in politics. Roughly a third of the vote goes to independents, Teals and Greens. That gives Albo a mandate effectively to say we need to speed things up. Does that mean then we can afford things like opening up the Beetaloo Basin in the Northern Territory for gas fracking? Do they have to walk back on that policy? Is that not a carbon bomb?
It is an absolute carbon bomb, and that's where I think your reading of the ALP is a little less generous than I am. At the end of the day, we have a huge legacy, thanks to the previous government, of a massive, like one of the biggest pipelines of new fossil fuel projects under development already in the planning process.
100 new fossil fuel projects, 114 according to is it the IEA. But just on this issue, my cynicism, of course, is to do with the follow the money thing, and the gas industry, the gas giants, are huge donors through APIA to their lobby group to Labor, and this is a huge conflict of interest for them, because they won't wanting to. They won't. It's the money in the politics, which I've always been cynical about. But the other issue, of course, which we've discussed on a few occasions, Tim, is the fact that these companies like ExxonMobil, which is my top of the top 40 tax dodgers, having brought in income of $70 billion in the past 7 years, according to the ATO transparency data, and not paid 1 cent in Australia in tax. Now, we just saw Boris Johnson, dragged along by Labor in the UK, come out with a super profits tax for fossil fuel providers. So is it sustainable then? In Australia, we have these giants paying, and Santos and Origin, of course, have been poor taxpayers and aggressive tax dodgers over the years. ExxonMobil and the international majors are the worst offenders of all, which is Shell, which is Exxon, and BHP pays a bit of tax. But is this sustainable when you've got people shivering under blankets this winter, energy bills going through the roof, to have these guys still paying no tax?
Yeah, I'll pick you up on one point there. BHP, for many of the last decade, the years in the last decade, has been either the number one or in the top 5 taxpayers in Australia.
Up there with the banks. Yeah.
Up there with the banks. So the reason why I actually make that point, I mean, BHP, like Rio Tinto, pay a huge amount of tax. Like we're talking $5-10 billion a year. They are incentivized to pay tax in Australia on their Australian profits, thanks to the franking legacy of Paul Keating. And so we actually have what I would argue is a completely unfair, unlevel playing field. Domestic Australian companies almost all pay 30% tax, corporate tax. They pay their royalties, but the more important number for them is their corporate tax. We've got this $3 trillion pool of self-managed super and superannuation that is all predicated on corporates actually paying tax to allow them to pay fully franked dividends. Where that strategy has fallen down is that there's a group of foreign multinationals, mostly operating in tax havens, who get no benefit from franking and therefore have no incentive to actually pay a fair share or even pay any tax in Australia. And so we've got an unlevel playing field where all of the Australian companies are doing the right thing by Australia. The foreign multinationals are looking after their billionaire owners. And so we need to close that massive, we need to level the playing field. So at the end of the day, if we think about the legacy Josh Frydenberg's left Australia, it's $1 trillion of debt. So I think AI Group called it a shit sandwich for the energy minister, but he also was implying it's a shit sandwich that the incoming treasurer has to deal with. $1 trillion of debt, a record high deficit.
Cost of living going through the roof. It's a huge hospital pass Albo's taken here, basically, isn't it?
Correct. And Albo's outlined a whole lot of policies to try and restore some social equity and social justice across Australia. That is going to cost money. So at the end of the day, someone's going to have to pick up the bill. And who better than someone using public Australian assets and they're paying nothing?
So is it a super profits tax? Is that the answer? You prefer a carbon tax approach, wouldn't you? Carbon exports, right?
I would call it a carbon export tax. Albo is being very careful. He doesn't want to go back on his promises that he made in the election. He said he wouldn't bring in a mining tax.
But you can do a Paul Keating and say the cupboard's bare, sorry.
Yeah, but we knew the cupboard was bare.
It's Josh's fault.
Absolutely, it is Josh's fault. It is the LNP's fault. But at the end of the day, Albo also wants to restore integrity and actually truth in politics, and let's hope a federal ICAC and some media reform and some donation reform. He's got a whole list of things he's got to do. Good luck, given the gas cartel's going to be lobbying like mad and undermining him if he does anything to hurt them. And by the way, who does APIA get funded by? All of those tax dodgers that pay absolutely no tax in Australia.
So he's got to go after them, really, because they are, at the moment, earning super mega profits, aren't they?
That's globally, the key point. They're making record high, supernormal profits. So what I would call it is let's go for a carbon export super tax. Boris Johnson's already led the way. Ken Henry has come out and endorsed this strategy. Someone's going to have to pay, and 25 million Australians are already paying. The 0.1% needs to pay, but there's a whole group there that actually has a vested interest in using Australia's public assets for private tax haven gain. We've got to bring in a assessment that they generate massive revenue in Australia. They've got to pay some tax.
Well, I noticed that I've just looked at the year to December accounts for ExxonMobil, the biggest. They've just gone from 12. They've added another $3 billion in income to take them, to 12 billion or thereabouts. So that's got a bit, and that's year to December. So that's not capturing the price rises in the last 4 or 5 months. So you'd have to think they're heading towards a $15 to $20 billion profit with these kind of prices.
I'd be estimating very conservatively.
Sorry, income, not profit.
Yeah. We need to look at their revenue, because the reality is they're masters at transfer pricing. All the profits just happen to disappear off to Singapore, their marketing hubs. The manufacturing hubs, to use Glencore's phrase, happens to make bugger all profit. They gear it up with all of the debt, all deductible. At the end of the day, you need to look at the revenue, and then you need to look at the sort of tax rates that maybe a BHP or Rio Tinto is paying in Australia and say, you impute the implied profits that we know what BHP is making, we know how much tax they're paying, you impute, and maybe you don't hit them with 30%. Maybe you give them a, look, we know you're going to dodge it if we ask you to pay a fair share. Why don't you pay half of a fair share? Now, if you do that sort of analysis, you can easily come up with $10 or $20 billion a year of extra corporate tax.
Extra revenue coming in. Yeah.
Coming in. Now, I will stress, I'm talking corporate tax. They pay royalties. All of their staff pay their personal income tax. They pay their GST. I'm talking corporate tax. I'm talking about real tax that they're responsible, not what their workers are paying, not the stamp duty, not the royalties for use of a finite resource that's owned by Australia. There's another thing called tax, corporate tax. They've got to pay some corporate tax. The idea that for a decade, each of these multinationals can earn tens of billions of dollars of revenue and pay nothing, they're going to have to pay something. And then I'd also go after the diesel fuel rebate. I would cap that. Let's just pick a really generous number, $100 million per firm.
The farmers would be screaming, of course.
No, $100 million. No farmer earns $100 million of revenue, let alone gets $100 million a year of diesel fuel rebate. Let's cap it. That will guarantee you not one single farmer, not one single small to medium-sized enterprise is affected, just the 10 biggest beneficiaries who collectively get maybe a $4 billion a year rebate. Let them have the first 100 million. I mean, it's really important that Twiggy get another $100 million of tax subsidies from us. Okay, I'm having a go at him.
Well, Twiggy's now paying $1 billion a year. Fortescue pays $1 billion in tax. Fortescue funds the ABC, you might say. He pays, I think it was 1.2 last year. So these guys are starting to, but he's domestic again, as you say.
Yeah, but the diesel fuel rebate applies to Twiggy, it applies to BHP, but it equally applies to the Chevrons and the Glencores and the Peabodys. What I want them to do, why are they in a period of record high profits, like supernormal profits, unprecedented in their entire history, and they're getting $10 billion of subsidies a year from the Australian taxpayer? We could save Albo or Jim Chalmers $4 or $5 billion immediately, and there would be 10 voices screaming murder, and 9 of them would be sitting in tax, or 8 of them would be sitting in tax havens. Okay, maybe.
Well, the answer to your question, of course, is they hire the best lobbyists that are most connected. They pay political donations, and they scream.
The louder they scream, you start with $100 million a year cap, and they scream for a day, make it 90, then make it 80.
Yeah.
Get it down to 10.
Bitten off like a Morocco car salesman.
Feel free to keep screaming, but the reality is no one who's shivering in their home because they can't afford to turn the heater on is going to actually worry about Chevron squealing from their tax haven.
No, so which brings us to political will, to walk back to political will to reform, which there's going to be a lot of pressure on both sides. So we've got this third force in politics now. It was suggested, one of our writers, Mark Sawyer, wrote a piece the other day saying, look, the future for Labor is in a grand progressive alliance with the Greens, like, the Nationals and the Liberals, that needs to be formalised, that marriage. Bernard Keane and Crikey just came out yesterday and he said that he believed the future for Labor was in a deal, an alliance with the Teals. And of course, the Greens and the Teals, right on the same page on climate, but on wealth redistribution and social equity, they're completely separate because the Teals are from wealthy electorates, so that's a natural constituency for them. What do you think? Where does Labor then go? Because when it comes to funding, of course, all the corporate funding goes to Labor, Liberals and Nationals. So in a money sense, that's where their heart is. But are they more likely to deal with the Teals or with the Greens? What do you think?
I'm a finance analyst, not a politician. I have worked with a number of the Teals. I respect them. They are elected by their communities. They are not beholden to any corporate interests. I think we need donation reform. At the end of the day, Albo's got in the lower house a majority. He's got 77, so he can actually do...
But he needs cooperation in the Senate, though.
He needs cooperation in the Senate, but there are things like the safeguard mechanism that Chris Bowen can activate tomorrow. No legislation, upper or lower house. It's actually been there now in place for many years. All the corporates on side. It was wonderful to hear Meg O'Neill, the CEO of Woodside, come out before the election and say she is 100% aligned with the safeguard mechanism being used as it was designed. But reinvigorated, given some teeth, give it some meaning, because obviously under Angus Taylor's watch, it had no teeth and no meaning and had no impact. But all Chris Bowen has to do is reduce the threshold by 3.5% every year. That gets us to a 100% reduction by 2050. That's the mandate Albo was given, 3.5% per annum reduction. That's set overnight by Chris Bowen, and all of the industry has actually already pledged, almost the entire Australian industry and corporates and finance have pledged to that alignment anyway. So as the CEO of Woodside came out and very bravely said, because I mean, you wouldn't have got that from Woodside ever before in Australian history, that we need to act on the climate science. We have to have a sensible path, and Woodside is committed to it. So a 3.5% annual reduction. Now, Chris hasn't come out with the number. Is it going to be 3? Is it going to be 4? I'd rather it was 4, but 3.5 gets you to 0 by 2050. That's his target. It has to go faster. But the reality is, once you get on that threshold, everyone goes faster. The technology has moved so far that once you realise you're on the right path, the speed of development will surprise everyone. That's probably been the biggest theme of my work for the last decade. Every single interview, every single discussion I have starts with, we're all surprised by the speed of the technology
by
disruption.
the deflation, by the rapid fall in the cost of new energy.
Zero emissions.
Well, I remember there was a
energy.
point when I was chatting to you 5 years ago, where, or it was maybe 7 years ago now, where the price of new coal, it was always claimed that the price of coal is cheaper to coal. You know, we've got plenty of coal, but there was a point when it became obvious, wasn't there?
Yep.
A few years ago, where the price of renewable energy was now cheaper than the price of old fossil energy. But there is a massive corporate deal on at the moment, which is transformational for the whole Australian economy, really, in terms of energy transition, and that's AGL. Now, Tim has a role in the background corporately in the AGL deal, but essentially what's happening here is Mike Cannon-Brookes, Grok, the tech billionaire, is making a play for control of AGL to get rid of the old coal fleet and to create, it's part of the renewable energy revolution. And right at the moment, we're seeing some drama unfold right now, aren't we, with the board of AGL has almost put up the white flag and said, we give up. So there's something just about to change right now. Does Cannon-Brookes get control of AGL? Is Brookfield back? The tax dodgers from Brookfield, are they back in the picture as well? What's happening?
Yeah, we don't know what Brookfield's doing, so maybe deal with them easily first. There's rumour in the mainstream press this week that Brookfield's still there, very much had flagged their interest to the board, that they would be happy to be invited in, but that they're not working in concert with Grok as they were a couple months ago. Now, everything can change overnight, anything's possible. I'm not working with Grok. I have a similar objective, which is for AGL to move from being a global laggard, an Australian laggard, to being an Australian leader. And that is the objective, that we, like the shareholders' resolution that got a 53% vote as put forward by the Australian Centre for Corporate Responsibility in September last year, backed by 53%. So an unprecedentedly strong signal from the majority of shareholders to the AGL board, which the AGL board took and then ignored. And 9 months later, we know the outcome. As you said, the chair, the CEO, and two independent directors have all announced they're going to resign and leave.
Just for the background, this is a company, AGL, with 4.5 million customers. It's the biggest carbon emitter, the most toxic carbon company in Australia, and its leadership over the past 5 years or so has blown up 2/3 of the market value of the thing. So it was clearly being run by a not very competent crew of people who their proposal was to split, to demerge, to get the dirty coal stuff and hive it over here off into a dirty coal company, bad co and good co, and keep your other stuff in the good company. That, when they announced that wasn't going to happen just the other day, of course, the share price didn't move at all. So people obviously weren't very keen on that deal. But does that mean that control will change now?
I think, well, we know control is going to change because the board, 4 of the 8 directors and the chair and the CEO, so those 4 control the direction and strategy and leadership of AGL. They're the ones, as you said, and a critical point here is they've destroyed 2/3 of the shareholder wealth in this company in just 5 years. Like, that takes a huge abrogation of their fiduciary duty, a huge failure. So it's overdue time for them to fall onto their swords. But to their credit, they have done that. They have accepted, they've read the tea leaves. Okay, it might have taken them a year or 2 or 5 longer than it should, and shareholders have worn that pain. But at the end of the day, they've read the tea leaves, they've decided to get out of the way and let board renewal come in. Now, the $5-6 billion question is who's going to actually pick up the mantle and run the leadership of AGL. I would love to see an independent chair and majority of independent board members. I think it would be brilliant if Mike Cannon-Brookes took a seat personally as a non-executive director. I think it would be really problematic if he took the chair, because ultimately he only speaks for 11% and he speaks for himself. What we need to see is AGL return to being an Australian leader and acting for all shareholders. So good corporate stewardship, good corporate governance would say, Mike has 11%, he's probably entitled to one seat. We need an independent, strong chair, and then a really experienced board that really understands finance, IT, and energy markets, and is able to work with the consensus we now have at the federal and state government. So critically, Victoria, New South Wales, and federally, because there's a federal overlay, we need the grid to be modernised and to enable a huge rollout of renewables. And if if AGL is to close Bayswater in 2030, if they close Loy Yang maybe 2 years later, that's got huge potential to disrupt everyone if it's not done in a really orchestrated, well-planned way that's not just AGL, it's AGL within the regulatory framework. And so that's where I've been absolutely delighted. And we've just knifed the LNP quite repeatedly. I'll give them a shout out. Matt Keane, New South Wales, has done a brilliant job. So at the end of the day, I don't care what colour, whether they're teal, whether they're green, whether they're ALP, red or blue, so long as they accept the science, they accept the urgency of the need, and they accept the interests of all Australia is far more important than the interest of Chevron. Any representative I'll work with who accepts all of those, they can't work for Chevron. They've got to actually work for all of the Australians. And as soon as you do that, Matt Keane, I mean, I'm still blown away by one announcement that he made 4 months ago, February. He came out and said, look, if his 3rd renewable energy zone, the Hunter Valley, he wasn't even going to have a Hunter Valley one. So the Hunter Valley constituent, the community pushed back and said, Matt, we're the ones most affected by the end of coal. Let's be part of the solution, a core part of the solution. And I think Matt Keane was blown away. He got $100 billion. That's not a stutter, $100 billion. It's an unimaginable amount of money. Investors putting forward propositions. And that was while Angus Taylor was still the bunny in charge in the feds, and $100 billion expressions of interest for one renewable energy zone. He got $30 billion in his first renewable energy zone. He got a $33 billion in the second, and he then got $100 billion in the third. He's got 2 more he wants to do. So we're talking about unlocking, just in New South Wales alone, hundreds of billions of dollars of capital, which will be grid firmed, so upgrade the transmission grid for these renewable energy zones, so you know where you need to plan, you know what needs to be expedited, you need to firm it. It needs to be wind and solar, it needs to probably have hydrogen, has to have batteries, it has to have a solution that's practical and implementable at speed. And you can build a wind farm in 2 years, you can build a solar project in 1 year, but it takes
And the battery storage is now up to speed. So
battery you can build in a year. What you can't build in a year is transmission. That'll take 5 to 10 years. So we're talking about a transition that will take a decade, but we have Matt Keane, New South Wales Energy Minister, we have Lily D'Ambrosi, the brilliant Energy Minister of Victoria, and we now have Chris Bowen in charge. The adults are back in charge, and we have consensus at the Fed and state level that allows the regulatory framework to be put in place Government then gets out of the way and lets finance and corporates build it out. Now, AGL has 5 gigawatts of coal plants to close beyond Liddell. So Liddell's 2, it goes in 2023. It then closes another 5 within 5 to 10 years beyond that. We need to actually see AGL replace effectively about 12 gigawatts of renewables. They have to be firmed. As you said, they've got to build the world's largest batteries. Well, AGL's got a plan to build 850 megawatts of batteries. So rather than it being a plan, they need to do it, and they need to do it ahead of the closure of the Bayswater and Loy Yang plants. And maybe they won't get all of those 12 gigawatts built. 12 gigs replaces 5 gigs because you've got utilisation rate differences. Coal runs 60% of the time, wind and solar 30% of the time. So you need more than double the capacity, the nameplate capacity, or replace the generation volume, not the capacity. So a little technical there, but at the end of the day, 5 gigs of coal means you've got to replace it with 12 gigs of firmed renewables, and that's got to be done within this decade before you close the coal plants. Matt Keane, Lily D'Ambrosi, the integrated system plan of the Australian Energy Market Operator has put all the framework in place. We just need the federal government to endorse that. I think Albo's 82% reduction, 82% renewables by 2030 entirely endorses that, and then get out of the way and let finance deliver it. That means unlocking $100 billion, $200 billion of new investment, massive regional investment, massive new jobs, and then we can actually see places like Tomago, like one of the dirtiest aluminium refineries in the world. Rio's committed to decarbonise Tomago by 2029. So AGL supplies all of the power to them. At the moment, it's all dirty power, very high emissions. Replace it with renewables, replace it with firming, replace it with some pumped hydro storage, create an integrated system plan, implement it, and all of a sudden the single biggest user of electricity in Australia goes from being really high emissions, like one of the highest in the world for aluminium smelting. Aluminium, by the way, is congealed electricity. So it's the way we can actually export our brilliant, low-cost, zero-emissions electricity, take bauxite, make it into alumina, make it into aluminium, and then export green. We make massive value.
It makes economic sense as well, and it's an incredible paradox that now the coalition, the coalition's out of the way, and it's an incredible paradox that here they are claiming to be free marketeers when they were actually standing in the way of the free movement of capital. They didn't want Cannon-Brookes to take control of AGL. They were looking for an excuse to block that. It was interesting to see that he came out a couple of weeks into the election campaign, didn't he? And went public on his latest move for AGL, almost giving the bird to Angus Taylor. Almost, perhaps, do you think that he sensed that they were going to go down, and that's why he came out at that time, or was it just coincidence?
I'm sure that was part of his thinking, but I think the fallback plan was, and I think this is a real threat for Australia, that if the LNP had got back in, we would have seen the national electricity market fall apart immediately. Would have seen the integrated system plan become obsolete and irrelevant. AEMO, the ESB, AEMC, they're all national. Well, they're not national. They're bodies that represent the East Coast and Northern Territory. So you'd see that framework fall down, and all of a sudden you'd be left with the states going it alone. Now, power is traditionally a state-based mechanism, but we had the development of COAG because you actually it's better for all Australians if we actually have cooperation at the national level. But if the feds had stayed obstinate climate science deniers and fossil fuel lovers, the states would have gone alone. Lily D'Ambrosi, Mick DeBenny in Queensland would have done exactly the same as South Australia has done, as Tasmania's already done, as the ACT's already done, and they would have just gone it on their own. So at the end of the day, AGL operates in 2 key markets, New South Wales and Victoria. And so they would have had to work with those 2 state governments, and the feds would have been irrelevant, just as Angus Taylor was dealt out of the equation when Frank Calabria at Origin did a deal with Matt Keane, the New South Wales Energy Minister, the LNP, New South Wales Energy Minister, and they worked for 6 months on a cooperative agreement that made sure Grid reliability was at the forefront of Matt Keane's agenda. Decarbonisation, dealing on the science, was at the forefront of Matt Keane's, but it was also at the forefront of Frank Calabria. Now, that was a deal. Angus Taylor got told the night before it was announced to the market. Someone didn't trust him to not stymie it, and I think that that caution was well deserved. So at the end of
which is incredible, because they're ticking off on things like, you know, private foreign operators who don't pay any tax taking over Australia's hospitals, KKR move on Ramsay, and of course Healthscope by good old Brookfield. In this case, just on that tax front, this is perhaps my only sniff of the downside, because you have to applaud Cannon Brooks. I mean, it's a grand idea, and it's a good billionaire doing the right thing, being a key part of energy transition. It's part of a global thing, hopefully, but just on the tax front. I mean, Atlassian isn't famous for paying tax. Brookfield, of course, aggressive chicanery on the tax front. AGL does pay. Well, last time I looked, it was like 100 million a year or something like that. So if these guys take it over, it's just what are the guys at the ATO going to be? They're going to be going on. I've had a look at the structure behind Grok. It's this tricky partnership with another partnership beneath it with sort of obscure Brazilian plant names, and it's all that tricky investment banker billionaire sort of structuring. How are they going to make sure this just doesn't get controlled offshore and be another tax shelter?
I think Australia and the Foreign Investment Review Board and the Tax Office needs to reevaluate our stance about allowing foreign takeovers of Australian companies.
Maybe they don't talk. Do they talk?
To each other? No, not at all. And so, I mean, for decades, I was the managing director, head of equity research at Citigroup, and I used to cover the brewing sector. So Lion Nathan and Carlton and United Breweries, brilliant sector to have to cover. I also did the wine industry, but let's not get totally distracted. CUB and Lion Nathan each paid hundreds of millions of dollars of tax every year to the federal government treasury.
Until they were taken over.
The day they were taken over, the biggest loser, like the shareholders got rewarded. They got a 30-40% takeover premium. They were happy to endorse it. The biggest loser of the takeover of those two breweries, between them had 97% market share. So it was a duopoly, enormously profitable, very cozy, and they paid a shitload of tax. That's a technical term. They went from paying a huge amount of tax to nothing overnight. The biggest loser of that was the Australian taxpayer.
Massive. And I always, when I look at the accounts of this, I used to go through them once a year. It was owned by SAB, and now CUB's owned by, this is 50% of the beer market. And they claim that they're not making a profit selling beer to Australians in a duopoly. I mean,
at a price that is $50 a case, $60 a case. When I was doing beer, it was the big threshold debate I had with the CEO of Carlton United Breweries was he was really worried about pushing the price of a slab of beer through $20. Right? I remember I was sitting in his office having a chat to him, and he's going, "Oh, Tim, we're not going to they pushed up the price of beer 3% religiously every year. They actually had government agreement. They could do it every 6 months in line with the excise, in line with the inflation rate. Every year it went up by 3% per annum." He goes, "Oh, the problem from going from $19.50 to $20, people don't, it's a one single note.
They won't buy their slabs
And for
anymore.
a year he held off. He actually was really worried about it. Now it's 50 or 60, 50 on a good day. That is pure profit. The brewery sector in Australia is the highest profit margin business in Australia other than iron ore and gas.
But being structured, of course, to pay no tax.
Structured to pay no tax. And anyone can structure it. You get a smart lawyer and a smart accountant and a smart finance in a room, they'll make sure they pay no tax overnight. So I hear what you're saying, but what I would therefore say, the best outcome I can see for Australia, not for Mike Cannon-Brookes, not for Brookfield, for all Australians, is that AGL stays listed. It's one of our largest, longest listed companies it's transformed and evolved and developed and been a leader and was in fact an industry leader. You mentioned under Andy Vesey, 7 years ago, AGL was actually a world leader. The share price was $28 because Andy Vesey sold the argument that AGL can profit by leading and getting ahead of the technology change and driving it. And shareholders love that story. Obviously,
there was a coalition government to contend with.
Josh Frydenberg made sure that Andy Vesey was removed by the board, and ever since we've had, so that was an unprecedented interference by our federal government in the actions of a private listed company and the outcome for shareholders. So Josh actually can wear that one. He can share part of the blame for the destruction of over $10 billion of shareholder wealth. Josh just left us with $1 trillion of debt, and he destroyed $10 billion of value for shareholders at AGL. But I'm off track here. He's gone. That's great for Australia. We can now actually have government for Australia, for Australians. And the best outcome is AGL stays listed, because the power base that, in fact, what made the chairman, Peter Botten, just fall on his sword this week was that the retail investor, the mums and dads, the superannuation, the self-managed superannuation holders were starting to vote with their feet, and the proxies were coming in. And at the end of the day, they want a solid dividend yield, and they want it fully franked. Now, AGL's mismanaged their business so badly that they haven't paid tax. They're struggling to even pay a dividend. And I say that it was financial manipulation that allowed them to pay a dividend. They fully underwrote the dividend reinvestment plan because they didn't actually have the cash to underwrite the dividend. So they had to issue 30, 40 million new shares in the last 12 months. Massive. Now, that's another stewardship fail, because Peter Botten and Graham Hunt only 2 years ago were busy doing a $600 million buyback at $19 a share. So they bought
now it's $8 a share, isn't it?
They bought them back at 19. They reissued them at an average of $6.30. Now it's $8. But they've actually managed to destroy probably about $400 million of wealth with that one stewardship fail, the share buyback. So this isn't just about climate change. It's about a repeat of bad corporate stewardship. So at the end of the day, when I talk to international domestic investors, whether they're retail or institutional, this is a stewardship issue. AGL had corporate governance failure, and we needed to refresh the board and have the board represent all shareholders. So to me, I'd go back. If I had my druthers, I would have an independent chair, prominent Australian, credible. I'd have an energy expert as deputy chair, a person who is absolutely au fait with the regulatory environment, they're au fait with the energy markets, and if I could get an extra, I'd throw in IT. If they were an IT expert and they understood the power of IT to disrupt the energy market, think about 10 million electric vehicles, or let's call them batteries on wheels. The battery capacity of those 10 million electric batteries on wheels combined is bigger than any power plant in Australia. So I'm projecting out 10 years, 15 years, but we have an integrated distributed energy resource. We have 50 gigawatts of rooftop solar. We have artificial intelligence and really modern state-of-the-art technology. Australia becomes a world leader. We could then export that technology and know-how to all the countries of the world.
Which means cheaper energy for households, but also good for the economy, because the cost of renewables is lower, so every business accesses. So
I'll pick you up 100%. Let me give you the pitch line from Octopus Energy. Now, Octopus is relied
in the UK.
Octopus UK. Now, Frank Calabria, one of the best deals he's ever done. It's probably saved the company. He bought 20% of Octopus Energy 3 years ago. His stake's now worth 300, 400, 500 times 500% of what he paid. But he's also brought the technology to Australia. AGL bought the UK equivalent, OVO, and they've deployed it in Australia. Now, Octopus Energy's pitch is every time it is too windy in the UK, the power price goes to zero, they offer to charge your battery and your electric vehicle for free. Now, it almost sounds too good to be true. You'll get free power every time it's really windy. In Australia, every time it's sunny. Now, it's predictably sunny every day. So every day, the power price in Australia is going to go to zero between 10 o'clock and 4 o'clock in the day reliably. Okay, maybe 300 days a year, you're going to get your power for free. So if you've got an electric vehicle, not only do you get no oil price bill, but you actually get free charging. And then you could sell that power, maybe 20%. Maybe you don't want to run your whole battery down. Maybe you say, I'm not going for driving a long distance tomorrow. You can have 20 or 30% of my battery overnight, and that then supplies power into the peak evening demand, record high prices, and that's where you get your grid reliability, and consumers are actually paid to be pro-consumers. They're integrated parts of the solution. But I can see a situation within 3 or 4 years where many, like millions of Australian consumers are paid or given free electricity every day to charge their batteries, to charge their EVs, and then they can use it for themselves. So they're self-generators, self-reliant, and then they feed it back into the grid. And so that's a really powerful situation, really deflationary, a great news story for 25 million Australians.
Unless they vote the horse and buggy brigade in again and we go for coal.
Let's rely on really expensive Middle East oil. Let's have total reliance on the Middle East for it, because Australia imports 20 billion bucks of oil a year. What I'm proposing is we actually use Australian wind and Australian solar and Australian hydro and Australian batteries to improve energy security for Australia, to drive further deflation, to decarbonise the industry, and then for Australia to be both a renewable energy superpower, to use Ross Garnaut's brilliant wisdom, his book, he's written 10 books on the topic. I think one thing Ross maybe underestimated was that Australia will inevitably be a renewable energy superpower, but we are going to be a mining industry superpower. The opportunity to do value adding, I talked about aluminium, but we could do that. Australia produces 48% of the world's lithium today.
Rare earths, yeah.
48% of lithium. We're also one of the top 5 rare earth producers. We're one of the top 5 nickel, cobalt, vanadium, graphite, you name it. We're in the top 5, or if not in the top 3, if not number 1 in the world. What we have failed to do under the previous government is value add those resources before you export them. And so what I see is the massive investment and regional employment and export opportunity of the lifetime, our lifetime, is for us to be a renewable energy and mining superpower. So rather than talking about iron ore exports, we export 38% of the world's iron ore. Let's export green iron. I don't believe that we'll be a green steel player at scale, but we could be the world's biggest green iron player, taking wind and solar, renewable energy, processing the iron ore, getting the oxygen out of the iron ore. So iron ore, FeO2, 3, 4, whatever it is, get the oxygen out and just export the iron. Lithium, let's export the lithium, not the lithium carbonate. 93% of the lithium carbonate is waste product. Why don't we process it onshore using renewables? So let's take Ross Garnaut's strategy. Australia becomes the renewable energy superpower. We become a mining industry superpower. We value add, and then we don't have to worry about the coal mining workers, because every one of those coal mining workers is now a lithium miner, or they're a cobalt or a copper or a nickel miner, because the lithium volumes of Australia are going to double and double again. The copper and cobalt and graphite volumes are going to double and double again. We need every one of those coal mining workers. We just need them to relocate to the mining industry of the future. And then on top of that, we need to value add, do some processing. The opportunities are so big for Australia. It's just obscene that the fossil fuel cartel that's controlled our federal government has managed to stymie the development of that inevitable outcome. It's because of one factor. And it's a point that I think the Murdoch media has been brilliant at ignoring and distracting us from. Australia is right up there with the fossil fuel mafias in Saudi Arabia and Russia. I say that deliberately. The 3 largest fossil fuel exporters in the world are Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Australia.
Well, now that the superior economic managers of the coalition are out of the way, we've got a chance of making it. But of course, the main impediment really is powerful vested interests that are making a lot of money from fossil fuels right at the moment, and who do fund the 2 major political parties. So that is the main impediment. It's just money in politics is the main impediment to reform, isn't it? Because these are magnificently profitable, although hugely dirty industries right at the moment.
So let's cut all the subsidies. Right? Jim Chalmers has a massive, massive challenge, but what he also has is an opportunity. Josh Frydenberg has been giving tens of billions of dollars of our money to the fossil fuel industry. They were making the biggest profits in world history, the highest profit margins. That is not an industry that needs subsidies. So now is the time to be aggressive, cut their subsidies, and then if Jim Chalmers can win a home run, you get them to pay some corporate tax, and all of a sudden the $40, $50 billion a year budget deficit that's hemorrhaging and that's probably understated, that actually can be probably reduced by a third overnight if we can make the fossil fuel industry pay some tax and stop giving them more subsidies.
Well, you have the Murdoch media, of course, shrieking about it and wailing and gnashing their teeth, which is something they don't want. They're all scared of Murdoch still, but we saw from the election that despite the aggressive campaigning, that's right, and we've got a third force in politics now. So times have changed. Let's just hope, of course, that the common sense and good economic management prevails over fossil fuel donations.
Correct. We need donation reform. We need truth in Parliament. We need a federal ICAC. I mean, let's think brown paper bags with $1 million. At the end of the day, that should be criminal. It is unethical.
I look forward to seeing the devil will be in the detail when we see the federal ICAC. People are very hopeful about it. I'm less hopeful when they look at the potential for blood on the streets down in Canberra. But in any case, it's been wonderful having you, Tim, for this chat. Fantastic issues, fantastic opportunities for Australia.
Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, mate.